Let's briefly tackle the question whether or not there are any Sumerian words in Turkish. The quick answer is yes, albeit not too many, but the somewhat longer answer is the more interesting one. First things first, we tend to attribute anything and everything we ourselves have failed at to either godly or alien forces, to the distant future or indeed the distant past. And since the ancient Sumerians or Egyptians or Maya cannot defend themselves, we can attribute just about anything we fancy to them. All the while, for example, not even knowing that Maya languages plural are still spoken today, just like many astrology fans would not be able to identify the constellations of the zodiac in the nocturnal sky throughout the seasons. Facts are usually less meaningful than feelings. So, Sumerian in this case was an actual language spoken and later perpetuated beyond its natural death by actual people. We can read it, it's not more or less divine or alien than any other language. Secondly, since Sumerian was not evidently related to any of the languages surrounding and succeeding it, it's usually considered a so-called language isolate, just like say Basque is in Europe, until we discover external connections, which can always happen, but it's equally probable that the entirety of Sumerian's linguistic family will forever be lost to time, given that the majority of human languages were and are not written until very, very recently. However, the human mind is not easily at ease with outliers. Therefore, more or less elaborate hypotheses on what languages Sumerian is related to abound. Turkish is no exception to this genealogical quest. Neither is Hungarian, Basque, Etruscan, Tamil, and many more. Hence, I want to make it abundantly clear that this is not the claim of the present video. I'm not claiming Turkish and Sumerian be actual relatives. It might well be the case, but we simply don't have at least 3,000 years of evidence that could elucidate how languages ancestral to Turkic, and not just Turkish, we'll talk about that, might be related to Sumerian, if at all. What I am talking about, however, are loanwords. No language exists in a vacuum. Any physically or at least culturally surrounding language will have at least a minuscule effect on the one we're dealing with, however amicable or inimical their relationships may be. Some of these loanwords are clearly identifiable. Let's consider these English words. Vis-a-vis from modern French, Zeitgeist from modern German, manga from Japanese, etc. But what about, say, cherry? Is that a loan word too? Well, it is. And that brings us to the topic of cultural spheres. Some languages, for better or for worse, we're not judging, simply stating facts, have had such an immense effect on a large number of other languages that they're the largest constituent factor of so-called cultural spheres. English, for example, is clearly in the Latin cultural sphere. I was easily able to use the somewhat adapted but still Latin words amicable and inimical a few sentences back. And even if I replaced inimical with hostile, I'd still be using a Latin word. In fact, about 50% of contemporary English is either medieval French, itself essentially altered Latin, or re-Latinized words from later periods. Words such as table, chair, plate, beef, language are all ultimately Latin, as opposed to the Germanic/Anglo-Saxon words seat, cow, or tongue. The ratio of Romance versus Germanic words changes in actual practice according to the nature of the text, of course. Why? Well, firstly, Britain was conquered by the French-speaking forces of William the Conqueror in the 11th century. That was not just another one of those innumerable conquests that history is littered with. It left an indelible mark upon English language and culture. So Latin is by no means dead. Its descendants such as French or Italian are still more than alive. Besides, its more or less standardized form was in ample use as a European lingua franca, as it's called, throughout the Middle Ages and well into modernity. It was essentially the English of the Middle Ages, the means of international and scholarly communication, which is why Latin, and through Latin also Greek, word stock permeates scientific vocabulary, say, in biology, philosophy, etc. Now, Latin and Old English, or Anglo-Saxon if you will, are distant relatives, so it was cousin interference. But this need not be the case. Chinese had a profound influence on Korean, and so had Arabic onto Persian, although these four languages are originally as distinct as English and any one of them. So some languages, such as mainly Latin, Sanskrit, Classical Arabic, Classical Chinese, had vastly greater influence on their neighbours than vice versa, due to religion, literature, cultural exchange, etc. Let's veer towards the Middle East and later on Central Asia. What were the major patterns? Well, full literacy started with the Sumerians in southern Iraq, about 5,000 years ago. Their writing did not come into existence without many rudimentary forebears, but they were the ones to refine it to a level that any uttering could be fully couched in cuneiform characters. It subsequently produced ample literature, ranging from myth and astronomy to court proceedings and letters. Sumer expanded itself, but was eventually conquered and superseded by Akkadian culture, as well as the different stages and/or dialects of Akkadian: Old Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian. Sumerian, however, did not disappear due to Akkadian conquest. It remained in prestigious use, just like classical Latin is still used by the Catholic Church today. Numerous Sumerian words entered different stages and levels of Akkadian, just like Latin words entered most European languages. The Latin word concentration, for example, can be found almost everywhere in Europe, always slightly adapted but always essentially the same word. Mesopotamian culture, languages and writing also irradiated onto neighbouring languages. The Hittites were amongst the conspicuously dominant forces that ruled over vast stretches of Turkey. Hittite is, surprisingly enough, very distantly related to English, but culturally it was written in the cuneiform script and was influenced by Akkadian, that had in turn been influenced by Sumerian. The Hittite Empire, notwithstanding its prior enormous importance, faded into obscurity towards the end of the second millennium BC, but other related Anatolian languages such as Lycian or Lydian took its place. However, these were also subsequently engulfed by greater cultural pressure exerted by Aramaic or Greek. The aforementioned cultural spheres can at times be extremely powerful. None of the Anatolian languages withstood the test of time. There were many more languages touching or entering this cultural sphere over the span of several millennia. Eblaite and Hurrian in Syria, Elamite and Old Persian in Iran, Urartian and Luwian in Turkey, and many more. But I'm concentrating on general patterns here. This is by no means an exhaustive list. Let's move somewhat forward in time. By the beginning of the first millennium BC, Akkadian had already started being replaced by Aramaic, a language from around Syria and Jordan. The predecessor of the language that Jesus spoke, as well as Syriac Aramaic, still spoken in the border region between Turkey, Syria and Iraq. The emerging Persian Empire that gradually conquered almost the entirety of the Middle East did use Old Persian for edicts and such, but the lingua franca, that is the English of the empire, was in fact also Aramaic. Its spread was definitely also aided by its simpler writing system, comprised of only 22 characters. Even Middle Persian, a later stage of Persian, was heavily infused with Aramaic, especially in orthography but also in vocabulary. The Persian Empire ultimately succumbed to the Arabs in the 7th century AD. Islam and its primary vehicular language, Arabic, became immensely dominant, not without absorbing large amounts of Aramaic though. But Persian, now in the guise of modern Persian, bounced back and became the second most important language of Islam by around the turn of the first millennium AD. By this point, Persian had already been heavily influenced by Arabic, as it still is today. Pronunciation differs substantially. Let's not forget that Persian proper is actually an Indo-European language, distantly related to English, but Arabic played a similar role vis-a-vis Persian as Latin did versus the different European languages. If we were now to turn our gaze towards a period starting even a little later than the previous one, and to move our geographical cursor more towards Central Asia, we'd see Turkic peoples, along with Mongolic and Tungusic speakers, gradually becoming more and more dominant and superseding the previously largely Iranian tribes who inhabited the Central Asian plains. The Turks of modern-day Turkey are by no means the only Turkic people. The eponymous peoples of countries such as Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, etc. also speak Turkic languages. Besides, large parts of Russia are inhabited by Turkic peoples. The Tatars around Kazan, the Yakuts or Sakha in Siberia, and tens if not hundreds of others. Russia's current geographical extent is largely due to colonization by land and the gradual replacement of earlier, usually Turkic dominions. Some of these originally tribal confederations oozed through Persia into Turkey, most importantly the Seljuks and the Ottomans. The conquest of Turkey by the latter was essentially complete by the year 1453, when Constantinople, today's Istanbul, irrevocably fell to them. History is never simple, by the way. There were Greek forces fighting under the Ottoman flag, as well as Turks fighting for the Romans, at that point Greek-speaking and often called Byzantians, but they simply called themselves Romans. And these kinds of phenomena can be observed throughout history. Now, the Ottoman Empire was hence heir to at least three originally very different cultural strands: the Turkic/Central Asian strand, Islam and its big two, Arabic and Persian. The Ottomans spoke Persian at court, as well as the previously heavily Hellenized culture of Asia Minor, Western Asia, Anatolia. All three components are well present in the Turkish language to this very day. However, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War, Turkish was actively reformed, absorbing oodles of French and Italian words, whereas many words of Arabic and Persian origin were recoined using Turkic roots and suffixes. Not all of these reformed words stuck. Some became obsolete again, some continued existing alongside their earlier counterparts, and so on. Besides, the infusion with Italian, especially Venetian, and French had already begun well during Ottoman times. After having had a look at these three different space-times, if you will, we must acknowledge that some of the cultures and languages were more peripheral than others. But 6 of the aforementioned languages form a continuous chain of profound influence. Sumerian exerted major influence on Akkadian. Akkadian was replaced by Aramaic, and Aramaic was in turn replaced by Arabic. But in both cases of replacement, the earlier languages were hugely influential in terms of vocabulary and grammar. Akkadian, Aramaic and Arabic actually belong to the same language family. They're all Semitic languages, which is why I've italicized their names here, whereas Sumerian, Persian and Turkish are in their pure forms, actually as distinct to Semitic languages as English is. Arabic was not replaced by Persian, but Persian subsumed tens of thousands of Arabic words. The same thing happened between Persian and Turkish, as well as some other Turkic languages, albeit not all of them. Of course, the different waves of influence differ in impact, and as can be expected, earlier influences tend to be drowned out by younger ones. Nonetheless, there are still many thousands of Arabic words in modern Turkish, always filtered through Persian, that was the intermediary. Furthermore, these Arabic words are often of Aramaic or Akkadian origin, and a few of these words, not too many, finally, can then be traced all the way back to Sumerian. We now see one such example here. The Sumerian word heykel was a compound word comprised of house, and gal, big. It thus simply meant building, edifice, any larger structure. Since much of religious and legal literature was about temples, palaces and other large structures, this word featured very, very prominently across millennia of cuneiform literature. So chances are high that when you're looking at a cuneiform tablet, there actually might be the word heykel on that tablet. It was then borrowed by Akkadian and slightly altered to conform to the language's structure. This is a ubiquitous phenomenon. Most conspicuously, it adopted the Akkadian nominative ending heykelum. Aramaic heykelah, or if we wanted to pronounce it more along the lines of modern Aramaic, heychlo, added a weak H sound, a few euphonic changes, and its own grammatical ending. Arabic modified the pronunciation a little, heykelun, and again added an ending, un. The ending was ultimately lost in Persian and Turkish, and the vowel pronunciation changed slightly. Thus, we get all the way from Sumerian heykel to Turkish heykel. The general meaning of the word had always been large structure, but as you can see, the individual languages usually focused on specific phenomena. In Arabic, for example, the word can also mean skeleton, and in modern Turkish the meaning is largely confined to monumental statue or sculpture. So we see a loan word in action, having crossed 5 millennia. Again, there's no divine intervention, and Turkish is definitely not Sumerian, but we can observe the profound cultural influence some languages exerted on others, as evidenced by large numbers of loanwords, which in turn is a very good barometer and tool for understanding historical patterns. And one last note, the influence oftentimes worked the other way around as well, so there are quite a few Persian words in Arabic, but fewer than there are Arabic words in Persian, just as an example. Alright, and that's that. Cheers!